I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I heard a sound I had not heard on my property in years. The deep growl of a diesel engine rolling up the gravel road like it owned the place. I looked down my kitchen window and saw a black Ford F-250 parked beside my old wooden gate. Three strangers in orange safety vests stepping out with measuring tapes, wooden stakes, and a confidence that bothered me more than the truck itself. One of them walked straight toward the weathered sign in my driveway, the one my grandfather built by hand back in 1992, and without even looking around, he pushed a bright orange marker stake into the ground about 10 feet from it. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. My name is Ethan Walker, and for most of my life, I thought owning a piece of land meant something. I grew up on that 46-acre property outside Red Hollow, Montana. My grandfather bought the land before I was born. My father raised me there, and after he passed, I spent years keeping the place exactly the way they left it. It wasn't some fancy ranch with a giant house or a tourist attraction. It was just home. A workshop, a small range behind the tree line, a few old trails through the sagebrush, and memories scattered across every corner of that dirt. So when I stepped outside that morning and asked, "Can I help you guys with something?" I expected a normal answer. Maybe a wrong address. Maybe a survey mistake. Instead, the oldest man in the group, a guy with a gray beard and a clipboard tucked under his arm, barely looked up at me. "We're establishing the restricted buffer area for the new Silver Pines Wellness Retreat development," he said. "County-approved project." I remember laughing a little because I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. "The buffer area? On my land?" I asked. He looked at the clipboard again, then back at me. "According to the map, this section falls inside the designated zone. There are certain moments in life when your brain needs a few seconds to catch up with what your ears just heard. That was one of those moments." I looked around at the fence line, the trees, the old barn my dad built, and then back at the stranger standing there telling me a piece of my property suddenly belonged to somebody else's plan. "You might want to check that map again," I told him. "I've owned this ground for over 30 years. He just shrugged. "Sir, we're contractors. We don't make the rules. If you have an issue, take it up with the county." And that was it. No apology. No explanation. Just three men putting stakes in the dirt like they were marking a parking lot. By noon, I got the answer they promised me, but it was not the answer I expected. A courier showed up at my door holding a thick envelope with a county seal stamped across the front. Inside was a violation notice claiming my property activities were interfering with the peaceful experience of the nearby wellness retreat project. The document referenced something called the Quiet Land Protection Ordinance, Section 8.3.1. The problem was simple. I had never heard of it. Not once. The notice said the ordinance had been approved just 5 days earlier. 5 days. And somehow, it already had my property number written across the top in blue ink. I sat there at my kitchen table staring at that paper longer than I want to admit. My coffee had gone cold. The room was completely silent except for the old refrigerator humming in the corner. I kept reading the same lines over and over, hoping I would find some explanation that made sense. But the more I looked, the stranger it became. They weren't saying I had broken an old rule. They were saying they had created a new rule and somehow managed to apply it to me almost immediately. That night, I drove my old Chevy Silverado into town and headed straight to the county records office. The road was covered in fog, and the courthouse parking lot looked like something out of an old movie. Those yellow lights buzzing above empty spaces while the wind pushed leaves across the pavement. Inside, I walked up to the clerk's desk and slid the notice across the counter. "Can you tell me when this ordinance was passed?" I asked. The woman behind the desk, a lady named Clara Benton, who had worked there for nearly 20 years, adjusted her glasses and typed into the system. A few seconds later, her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. "That's strange," she said quietly. "I can't find this ordinance in the official database." I leaned closer. "What do you mean you can't find it?" She looked at the paper again. "I mean, according to our records, this does not exist as an active county ordinance." And right there, standing under those cold courthouse lights, I felt something shift, because suddenly this wasn't about a boundary dispute anymore. It wasn't about some developer wanting a little extra space. Someone had handed me a piece of paper that looked official, sounded official, and carried the weight of authority. But according to the county's own records, it wasn't real. And if that was true, the question was no longer why they wanted my land. The question was how far they were willing to go to take it. I barely slept that night. I kept telling myself there had to be a simple explanation. Some paperwork error. Some lazy employee who clicked the wrong box and accidentally sent me the wrong notice. I wanted to believe that because the alternative was harder to accept, the idea that someone could sit in an office, create something that looked official, and use it to pressure me off my own land sounded ridiculous. The kind of thing you hear in a story and think, that can't actually happen. But when it is your name on that paper, when it is your family's property sitting behind those words, it feels very different. At around 2 in the morning, I was still sitting at my kitchen table with every document I owned spread out in front of me. I had my grandfather's original deed, old property surveys, tax records, and every piece of paperwork I had saved over the years. My kitchen looked less like a place where someone ate dinner and more like a detective's office from an old crime show. Except instead of solving a murder, I was trying to figure out why somebody suddenly believed they could rewrite my life with a stamp and a signature. The next morning, I went back to the county records office and asked Clara if there was any archived material connected to the ordinance. She hesitated for a moment, then disappeared into a back room. When she came back, she was carrying a thin gray folder. "This is the only thing I found," she said. "But you didn't get this from me." That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know. Inside the folder was a draft proposal for something called the Quiet Land Protection Ordinance. At first glance, it looked almost identical to the notice they had sent me. Same wording, same section numbers, same official-looking formatting. But the details started falling apart the longer I looked. The approval date on the notice didn't match the county schedule. The signatures were out of order. The final approval stamp was missing, and the person who supposedly authorized the ordinance, Deputy Planning Director Marcus Vail, had signed the draft 2 days before the public hearing where the county board was supposed to discuss it. I stared at that signature for a long time, not because I was shocked someone could make a mistake, but because I knew this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting a date. A mistake is filing the wrong form. This was someone taking a draft, dressing it up like a law, and sending it to homeowners before anyone had officially approved it. I left the courthouse with copies of everything I could legally obtain, and on the drive home, my mind kept going back to the 3 men at my gate. They weren't there because of a misunderstanding. They were there because somebody told them they had permission. Somebody had handed them a map and expected nobody to question it. When I got home, I called my attorney, Sarah Whitmore. She had helped my father with a property issue years earlier, and she was the kind of person who never wasted words. I sent her the documents, and about an hour later, my phone rang. "Ethan," she said, "where did you get this notice?" I told her everything. The workers, the stakes, the ordinance, the courthouse. There was a long pause on the line. "Do not contact the developer," she finally said. "Do not argue with the county employees. Do not give them anything they can use against you. Right now, we need to prove one thing, that they acted before they had the authority to act." The more we dug, the clearer the picture became. Silver Pines Wellness Retreat wasn't just a random project. They were planning a luxury health resort on the neighboring property, and my land sat right along their eastern boundary. My range, my access road, and my tree line were apparently considered inconvenient for the peaceful image they wanted to sell. A perfect, quiet retreat looks better in a brochure when there isn't a working property next door with a man who refuses to move. Sarah discovered that the developer had been pushing the county for months to create a larger buffer zone around the project. They wanted extra distance, fewer complaints, and complete control over the appearance of the surrounding area. The problem was, my property existed before their plans did. My family had been there for decades. They couldn't buy me out, and they couldn't legally force me to change what I was doing. So instead, they tried to create a rule that would make my land impossible to use. That realization hit me harder than the original notice, because this wasn't about noise. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about protecting anyone's peace. It was about convenience. Someone had decided my property was an obstacle, and they believed they had enough influence to move that obstacle out of their way. 3 days later, Sarah filed for an emergency injunction. We submitted the original deed, county archive records, the incorrect timeline, and a sworn statement from Clara confirming the ordinance was never officially active when the violation was issued. Then we waited. And waiting is the hardest part of any fight like that. People think the courtroom is where everything happens. But honestly, most of the battle happens in silence. It happens at your kitchen table at midnight. It happens when you check your phone every 5 minutes. It happens when you wonder if the other side has more money, more connections, more power than you do. I had those thoughts. I would be lying if I said I didn't. But every time I walked outside and saw that old wooden sign my grandfather made, every time I looked across those fields where my father taught me how to work, I remembered why I was fighting. It wasn't because I wanted to win some argument with a county office. It was because if I let them erase my rights because it was easier for them, then what exactly was all that history worth? A week later, a local reporter named Jenna Collins contacted me. She had heard rumors about the ordinance and wanted to know why nobody could find it in the county records. I almost said no. I didn't want attention. I didn't want cameras or headlines. I just wanted my property left alone. But Sarah looked at me and said something I still remember. Sometimes the only thing people with power fear is sunlight. So I agreed to meet her outside the county building with the documents in my hand. I didn't know it yet, but that conversation was about to turn a quiet property dispute into a fight the entire county would be watching. The morning the story aired, I woke up before my alarm even went off. I remember lying there staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around me. Those little noises you usually stop noticing after living somewhere long enough. The pipes ticking, the wind brushing against the windows, the floorboards making those familiar sounds like the house itself was breathing. For years, those sounds meant comfort. That morning, they felt different. They felt like a reminder that everything I had built, everything my family had protected, was suddenly connected to a fight I never asked for. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stood by the window looking toward the gate where those orange stakes had been planted just days earlier. It bothered me more than I expected. Not because of the wood itself. A few pieces of plastic and lumber shouldn't have the power to upset a person. But those markers represented something bigger. They represented someone walking onto my land and assuming they already had the right to decide what happened there. I never wanted attention. I wasn't trying to become some local hero or turn my situation into a public battle. Honestly, if someone had told me 6 months earlier that I would be sitting in front of cameras talking about county records and property rights, I probably would have laughed. I'm just a guy who likes working with his hands, fixing old equipment, spending quiet mornings outside, and keeping the land my family gave me in good shape. But sometimes life puts you in a position where staying quiet becomes its own kind of decision. And I knew if I backed down, it wouldn't just be about me anymore. It would send a message that if someone had enough influence, enough money, or enough connections, they could make the rules appear after the fact and hope nobody looked closely. When Jenna Collins's report finally aired, I watched it sitting at my kitchen table, the same place where I had spent those sleepless nights going through documents. She didn't make me look like some angry landowner fighting progress. She simply showed the timeline. She showed the county notice. She showed the missing approval records. She showed the difference between a draft document and an actual law. And that was enough. Within hours, my phone started ringing. First it was neighbors, then people I barely knew, then even a few homeowners from other parts of the county who had questions about their own properties. Some people told me they supported me. Others said they understood why the county wanted to attract new development and improve the area. I actually respected those conversations because not everyone who disagreed with me was my enemy. But there was one thing almost everyone agreed on. Nobody wanted to find out that rules could be changed quietly and applied before they were even real. The pressure on the county grew quickly. The same officials who had ignored my questions at the beginning were suddenly answering questions from reporters, residents, and their own colleagues. The county released a statement calling the situation a procedural misunderstanding, but that phrase bothered me. A misunderstanding is when two people remember a conversation differently. A misunderstanding is when someone sends the wrong email or schedules a meeting on the wrong day. What happened to me involved official paperwork, a property violation, and people showing up with a map claiming authority they did not legally have. Calling it a misunderstanding felt like putting a small bandage over a much bigger wound. A few days later, the emergency county board meeting was scheduled. I arrived early and sat in the back for a while just watching people walk in. Some had signs. Some had folders full of their own questions. Some were simply curious. But there was a different energy in that room. People were paying attention. They wanted answers. When Marcus Vale walked in, I noticed something I hadn't expected. He looked tired. Not nervous exactly, but different from the man who stood at my gate reading from his clipboard like everything was already decided. Power looks very different when everyone starts asking questions. He sat at the front table with several county officials, and for the first time since this began, he wasn't the person holding all the information. The public was. When my name was called, I walked toward the microphone carrying the same folder I'd been carrying everywhere for weeks. It was nothing impressive, no fancy presentation, no expensive legal team standing beside me, just paper, documents, dates, records, proof. And honestly, that felt right, because the entire fight started with a piece of paper that claimed something was true. The only way to fight it was with pieces of paper showing what was actually true. I placed the original deed on the table first, then the archived draft ordinance, then the county timeline showing the approval process had not been completed, then Clara Benton's statement confirming the ordinance was not active when the violation was issued. I looked around that room and saw people leaning forward, listening carefully. I took a breath and said, "For 50 years, my family has lived by the rules. We paid what we owed. We maintained our property. We respected our neighbors. But a government document doesn't become a law just because somebody prints it on official-looking paper." The room stayed quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet where people are actually thinking. The board members reviewed the documents one by one. Questions started coming. Why was the violation issued before approval? Who authorized the contractors to mark the property? Why was the developer provided information about a buffer zone that did not legally exist? And slowly, the story that had been presented as a simple zoning issue started falling apart. Marcus Vale tried to explain. He talked about confusion between departments, communication problems, and an accelerated timeline because of the development project. But the more he explained, the more obvious the problem became. Nobody was asking why a mistake happened anymore. They were asking why nobody stopped it. After hours of discussion, the board voted to withdraw the violation against my property. The words were simple. The decision was official. But sitting there, hearing it read aloud, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Not excitement, not revenge, just relief. Because the truth had finally caught up with the story they were trying to tell. After the meeting, a few people came over to shake my hand. One older man told me, "I thought you were just fighting over a fence line when I first heard about this." I laughed and said, "Honestly, so did I." Because that's the strange thing about these battles. They rarely start as something huge. They start with one person saying, "Wait a minute, that doesn't seem right." 2 weeks later, I walked out to my property at sunset. The orange stakes were gone. The markers had been removed. The land looked the way it had looked before all of this started. The mountains in the distance turned orange under the evening light. The wind moved through the grass, and for a moment everything felt normal again. I walked over to the old wooden sign at the entrance and ran my hand across the carving my grandfather made decades earlier. That sign had survived storms, winters, and years of change. And standing there, I realized something. The fight was never really about the dirt. Dirt can be bought and sold. The fight was about memory. It was about the idea that ordinary people still have a voice when someone bigger decides they don't matter. But even after everything was settled, people continued debating what happened. Some believed the county was simply trying to support economic growth and made a mistake along the way. Others believed this was a warning about what can happen when private interests get too close to public decisions. Maybe the truth sits somewhere in between. Real life is rarely as simple as a hero and a villain, but I do know this. When someone tells you something is impossible, when someone tells you the paperwork is already decided, when someone tells you to stop asking questions, that is usually the moment when asking more questions matters the most. So I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought all the way through? Or would you have tried to negotiate and avoid the public battle? Do you think the county made a mistake? Or do you think someone crossed a line? Share your thoughts in the comments because these conversations matter, and sometimes the biggest lessons come from hearing different sides of the same story. If this story made you think about your own rights, your own community, or the place you call home, share with someone who would appreciate it, because at the end of the day, a piece of land is never just a piece of land. Sometimes it is a lifetime of memories, and sometimes protecting it means being willing to stand alone until someone finally listens.